So what do we mean by that? We mean that they travel shorter distances. What are the components that travel shorter distances? They're the neurotransmitters. In the endocrine system, we have, on the other hand, longer duration of initiation of the stimulus, and once it's stimulated, it stays for a longer time. And that is because we are using hormones instead of neurotransmitters. So those hormones, they will go from the endocrine gland to the blood, and then through the blood, and then to the target organ, to the receptor, and the initiator. Now, nervous system has specific locations. For example, I decide in my head I want to move my arm. So the stimulus will come directly to my arm, to the specific cells that I want to move. However, in the endocrine system, once the hormone is released, it will go and get attached to its specific receptor wherever it's found. Whenever it finds the receptor, it will go and bind to it. Neurotransmitters, they act over short distances, I said, because of the neurotransmitters, and endocrine, because of the hormones, they take longer. Okay, we have a question. A patient receives a drug that blocks hormone receptor bonding. Which physiological response would be the most affected? Yeah?
Long-term regulation of growth.
Bravo. Guys, clap. Give him a good Okay. So in the endocrine system, we have two types of glands. We have exocrine and endocrine. The endocrine, they release hormones, so hormonal secretion the whole time. Exocrine, they release non-hormonal secretions. What do I mean by that? Like, for example, saliva, digestive enzymes, things like that. And they contain a duct. I'm talking about the exocrine. Endocrine, they don't contain a duct, and they're highly vascularized. They contain a lot of lymphatic drainage system and blood vessels to take the hormone and transport it to the target. Okay, endocrine glands, it can either be pure or pure gland. So pure glands, they're just glands. They don't have any types of cells inside them other than glandular cells. So we have, on this topic, we have pituitary, thyroid, parathyroid, adrenal, pineal. We'll walk through them all. Neuroendocrine organ, we only have one, hypothalamus. Why? It has endocrine tissue and neural tissue. So it has both electrical stimulation and hormones. There are organs that contain endocrine cells, but not all of it is endocrine. They only have endocrine cells inside them. This includes pancreas, gonads, placenta. The rest of our organs in our body, they have diffuse scattered cells here and there that do secrete hormones as well. Okay. Difference between hormones, autocrines, and paracrines. Hormones are strictly bound to endocrine systems, so they're always part of the endocrine system. Autocrines and paracrine, it's kind of controversial, so we don't know for sure that they're included strictly within the endocrine system or not. Hormones, they act over long distances. As I said, they go to the blood, to the target organ, through the blood. However, the autocrine and the paracrine, they don't go to the blood. They stay in the tissue fluid. They get secreted from the cells. They stay in the tissue fluid. And they go to nearby locations. Autocrine, as the name suggests, they have an effect on the same cell. Paracrine, they have an effect on the nearby cells. Okay? Say, for example, I'm Egyptian and my neighbor is Algerian, so we're different cell types. So I will give her food, okay? So I transport that food, that is the hormone, the food. I will give it to her. She is a different cell type, but we're within the same organ, within the same tissue. Okay? The area of effect of the hormones is widespread because it goes through the blood. Here, very localized because it's within the same tissue. Long-lasting, short-lived, short-lived. Yeah, basically this table is also really important. Okay. A chemical messenger is released by topless cells arranged in cords near capillaries. It acts locally on neighboring cells within the same tissue and does not travel through the bloodstream to distant organs. What is this messenger? Yeah?
Farah.
Once.
I want to ask you a question.
Okay. We have chemical structure of hormones. It can either be amino acid based or steroid based. Amino acid based, it has a very vast variety. It can either be amine derivative, like a single amino acid derivative, or it can be a peptide, or it can be a big protein. So this is why there's a big variety. It is soluble and not bound to a plasma protein, just passes on its own through the bloodstream until it reaches the target cell. And it can't cross the plasma membrane because the plasma membrane is what? Lipid. So so it can't pass directly. Steroids, on the other hand, they can pass directly. They include only gonadal and adrenocortical hormones, and they cross the plasma membrane. Okay, another question. Does anyone want to read? I'm reading all the questions. A 30-year-old patient has a tumor that secretes excessive epinephrine. Lab tests show very high plasma catecholamine levels, but only a brief spike in the physiological effects is observed after its release. Which property of the epinephrine best explains the short-lived effects? Yeah.
Me?
Yeah, that's correct. We have three types of stimuli: humoral, neural, and hormonal. So whatever the stimulus is, the hormone levels, they always stay within a narrow range, and they're mediated by a negative feedback mechanism. So say, for example, I secreted TSH to release thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone, if it's increased in amount, which is a specific level, it will go back to inhibit the first organ that secreted that hormone. So hypothalamus, pituitary, we're going to come back to that later. So humoral, neural, hormonal. Humoral, as the name suggests, means bodily fluid. So specific ions, specific important ions and nutrients inside the body, they influence the release of hormones. Neural, it is stimulated by electrical impulse. Hormonal, it is stimulated by another hormone. Okay, hormonal stimuli. As I said, an example to this is the hypothalamic pituitary target organ, endocrine organ. And Farah will also explain this, that each hormone affects the release of the next hormone to help mediate the effect in that. This explains the same thing basically, so this is the example I've discussed. Here, an example to the neural stimuli is the medulla of the adrenal gland. It receives impulses from the spinal cord, releases epinephrine and norepinephrine into the capillary to the target organ. Humoral stimuli, levels of calcium. So low levels of calcium will stimulate the release of parathyroid. Parathyroid will go and increase it back up. Okay, nervous system can always modify the turn off and the turn on signals. Say, for example, the normal levels of sugar is 90 milligrams per 100 milliliters of blood. If we want more, say, for example, in stress situations, we're going to have to stimulate the nervous system. Will stimulate the specific gland, and it will tell that gland that, oh, I want more sugar, even if the normal level is not this, but in that situation we need it. Okay, cells responding to hormones. The amino acid-based hormones, they have the receptors on top of the plasma membrane because they can't cross, so they just bind to it, and through a secondary messenger system, the effect will be mediated inside the cell. Or it can be inside the cell. Inside the cell only instead lipid-based hormones, and because they can cross the plasma membrane, they will go to the surface of the nucleus and they will stimulate the transcription of specific proteins. So yeah, this basically just says what I've said now. Okay, now there are three things, this is really important, three things that affect the target cell response: the number of the receptors, the number of the hormones, and the affinity of the binding. Imagine like the magnet being the receptor, and the pins are going to be the hormones. So the more magnets, the more pins, the more they get attached together, the more amplified the response is. Okay, upregulation and downregulation. For example, if there is like an increased amount of hormones in the blood, that's an downregulation. If there is an increased amount of hormones in the blood, it will go and then it will stimulate the cells, the response cells, to downregulate the receptors. So they will tell the cell, please remove some of your receptors because I'm an increased amount right now and I don't want overstimulation. Upregulation is the opposite. If we have lower amounts of hormone and we want the effect to be more amplified, we're going to increase the receptors to increase the response. Another name of downregulation is desensitization. Okay, hormone interactions. And now hormones, they can sometimes affect the receptors of other hormones. Say, for example, progesterone, when it's released, it will cause the downregulation or causes the removal of receptors from the target cell surface of the estrogen receptors. And vice versa. If we have estrogen, it will increase the progesterone receptors. So this is how basically hormone interacts in terms of receptor availability. Half-life of a hormone is the amount of time required for concentration of a hormone in the blood to decrease by 50%. And in protein-based hormones, or the water-soluble ones, they have a shorter half-life because they're rapidly cleared by the kidneys. Why? Because they're water-soluble. In steroid case, in the case of lipid-soluble hormones, they have to go to the liver first to be metabolized into from steroid-based to amino acid-based or soluble form in order to be excreted by the kidneys, and that's why it takes longer to be excreted if it's lipid-soluble. And hormone blood levels depend on the rate of secretion and rate of removal. The rate of removal, as I said, again, water hormones is faster than the lipid-soluble hormones. How are they removed from the body? Liver, kidneys are the main players, and breakdown products are excreted mainly in the urine and sometimes a bit in the feces. Okay, the onset and duration of the hormone. Steroid hormones in general, to sum this up, steroid hormones, they have a longer effect compared to amino acid hormones, and that's because they get bound strongly to their receptors. And duration of the hormones, they last, for example, from 10 seconds to several hours. It varies from hormone to hormone. And the effect, it's either, like, depends on the hormone. It can stay persistent even when the levels of the hormone lower down, or the effects can be, like, eradicated with the eradication of the hormones or the breakdown. Okay, another thing I want to mention is that many hormone characteristics, they depend on the water versus lipid solubility. These things include the transport of the blood, whether bound to the protein or not, half-life, onset of action, duration of action, how fast they're broken down. All those things depend on the chemical structure of the hormone. Okay, this is basically sums everything that I've said. This is very high yield, focus on this table a lot. Okay, interaction of hormones at the target cells. It can either be permissiveness, synergism, antagonism. As the name suggests, permissiveness is basically one hormone permitting another hormone to have its effect. Synergism is that they have the same goal. So say, for example, epinephrine and glucagon. Epinephrine is released when we're stressed, so we need more glucose. Glucagon is released when we also want to increase the glucose. So the combined effect of both, say, for example, this will lead to 100% effect. Combined effect of both will lead to 150%. They have the same effect. Antagonism is when hormones oppose the action of other hormones. Insulin and glucagon is an example. Insulin lowers the glucose, and glucagon increases the glucose, so they're antagonists. They're opposite to each other. Okay, what are the three mechanisms? Oh, this was supposed to be a question. Oh my god. Okay, what is the three mechanisms of antagonism? You either compete for the same receptor, so we have one receptor, and they're competing for it, or they act through different metabolic pathways, or they cause the downregulation of receptors of the opposing hormone. So for example, if I'm a hormone, I will find the receptor has a lot of, the cell has a lot of receptors for my opposite hormone, for my opponent hormone. I will tell the cell, no, remove those receptors, I don't want them here. So this is the last point. Okay, that's it from my part.
Okay, so now we're going to go over the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So before we get started, let's look at their location in the body. So here we have the brain. As you can see, it's a cross-section, it's a section from the brain. As you can see here, this is the hypothalamus, and beneath it is the pituitary gland. Now, how it works is that the hypothalamus will secrete hormones. These hormones will then travel down and act on the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland, in response, will release hormones that will act either on the target organ itself or on other tissues. Now, just for your information, the pituitary gland is located in the skull in a bone called the sphenoid bone, and it's located in a sella turcica. Basically translates to a saddle because it basically like fits into a saddle shape. Okay, so the pituitary gland is also called the hypophysis. It's connected to the hypothalamus by the infundibulum. And it has two lobes. We have an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe. Now these two lobes have different functions, different origins, and they even secrete different hormones, which we will talk about now. But as a whole, the pituitary gland secretes 8 either neural control, and that's for the posterior pituitary, or hormonal control, which is for the anterior pituitary. And I'll explain this in a second, but because it controls the secretion of glands, it's basically called the master endocrine gland. And we know that the hypothalamus is part of the nervous system, but it regulates the control of endocrine organs. And so it basically links the endocrine system to the nervous system. Yeah, so the hormones it secretes are neurohormones. Neurohormones basically hormones that are secreted by neurons. And this is in the case for the posterior pituitary. The two neurohormones are ATH, which is antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. And then in terms of its control on the anterior pituitary, it secretes releasing and inhibiting hormones. Now these are like, from the name, they either stimulate the release of hormones from the pituitary or they inhibit the release of hormones from the pituitary. Okay, so let's start with the pituitary, posterior pituitary. Posterior pituitary contains neural tissue, mainly because it's basically a continuation of the hypothalamus. So it contains axons and axon terminals from neurons in the hypothalamus. Now, one very important point about the posterior pituitary is that it does not produce its own hormones. It only stores them and releases them whenever there's a stimulus. The hormones are produced in the hypothalamus. Now, there are two areas in the hypothalamus that are responsible for producing these hormones, which are the supraoptic and the paraventricular nuclei. Now, does anyone remember what a nucleus is from the central nervous system chapter last semester? Yeah? Exactly. So it's a group of neurons. They're located in the hypothalamus. These neurons produce the hormone. The hormones will then travel down to the posterior pituitary where they are stored. And I'm going to show you the figure here. So here in the hypothalamus, we have the paraventricular nucleus, which produces mainly oxytocin, and the supraoptic nucleus, which produces antidiuretic hormone. Now, these two hormones, they will travel down the axon terminals. So they will travel down something called the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. Now again, a tract is a collection of axons, right? So it will travel down these axons where they will be stored in the axon terminals. So again, they are produced in the hypothalamus, but then they travel down to the posterior pituitary where they are stored in the axon terminals. And then whenever we have an action potential that comes down, it will stimulate the secretion of that hormone from the posterior pituitary, where they will be released into the systemic circulation and they will exert its effects. Okay, so the first hormone is oxytocin. Oxytocin, as I mentioned earlier, is produced mainly by the paraventricular nucleus. Now, one very important piece of information about oxytocin is that it acts by a positive feedback mechanism. And I'll explain this in a second, which will make more sense. So it has two main functions. Number one is that it stimulates uterine contractions. Now, this is very important in labor and in childbirth. And the second main function is that it stimulates the ejection of milk. Now, very important is that it does not produce milk, it only stimulates the production of milk by something we call the let-down reflex. Okay, so let's take the uterine contractions example. So during birth, the uterus will contract. This will send afferent impulses to the hypothalamus, where the hypothalamus will be stimulated to produce oxytocin. The oxytocin will then travel down through the hypothalamus-hypophyseal tract, and it will stimulate the secretion of oxytocin into the systemic circulation. Oxytocin will then act on the uterus and will stimulate even more uterine contractions. More uterine contractions, more oxytocin, more uterine contractions, and this process will be repeated until the child is born. And for milk ejection, basically it acts on the mammary glands in breastfeeding and nursing women. So whenever we have suckling from the baby, it will stimulate certain cells around the mammary gland called myoepithelial cells. Now from the name, myo, muscle, okay? So oxytocin will stimulate the contraction of these muscle cells, which will push the milk into the baby's mouth. So if we have more suckling, we will have more oxytocin, and then that will lead to more milk production, and this will continue until we have enough milk production. And it also stimulates facilitates bonding and trust. So the stimuli for oxytocin is neural. Why? Because it's when it's secreted, we need an action potential to come from the hypothalamus, which will trigger its secretion. Okay. Guys, was that clear? Does anyone have any question? Okay, perfect. Now for antidiuretic hormone. Whenever you hear antidiuretic So, antidiuretic hormone will stimulate the kidneys to reabsorb more water, so to make sure that we retain more water in the body. Okay? So, whenever we have antidiuretic hormone production, now I want to mention one thing because I forgot to mention it earlier. It's produced by the supraoptic nucleus in the hypothalamus. Okay? So, whenever we have antidiuretic hormone secreted or like produced from the hypothalamus, it will travel down to the pituitary and it will wait for a signal. What's the signal? We have certain receptors that are called osmoreceptors. So they will detect the concentration of blood, for example. When we have high concentration of blood, it means we do not have enough water in the body. So high osmolarity, basically, we will not have enough water in the body. So antidiuretic hormone will be stimulated to be secreted, and then it will act on the kidneys to increase water reabsorption, so more water is retained. Now, if we have more water retained, what happens to the urine volume? It's decreased, right? Because more of the water is retained and less is lost in urine. Okay? Now, one other function of antidiuretic hormone is that when a lot of it is secreted when we have low blood pressure, and it will stimulate the blood vessels to constrict. Okay? And that is to maintain high blood pressure because, of course, if we have low blood pressure, it's not good for the body and for the body functions. So we want high blood pressure to maintain the movement and circulation of blood. So the stimuli for antidiuretic hormone secretion is when we have high osmolarity, even if we have pain, low blood pressure, and then there's also certain drugs that stimulate the secretion of antidiuretic hormone. Now, what inhibits antidiuretic hormone? Number one, if we have adequate hydration. If we have enough water in the body, why would we want to increase the amount of water in the body? That's not good. It will lead to very diluted plasma, could lead to even edema, and we do not want that. So it will inhibit antidiuretic hormone secretion. The other one is alcohol, that's alcohol consumption. So when someone consumes alcohol, alcohol inhibits antidiuretic hormone. So less ADH is secreted, which means less water is retained in the body. And so the effects are polyuria, this is very important, polyuria meaning high urine volume, and also extreme thirst, which is called polydipsia. Okay? So yeah. Now let's talk about the disorders associated with the posterior pituitary hormones. Whenever we have very low amounts of antidiuretic hormone, it will lead to something called diabetes insipidus. What happens here is that we have low ADH, so not a lot of water is retained in the body. So what happens is that a lot of water, instead of being retained in the body, it will be lost in urine. And so urine production will be very high, and that is called polyuria. And then again, if we have a lot of water lost, the plasma and blood concentration will be very high, and so we will have polydipsia, which is extreme thirst, because if we have high osmolarity, it will stimulate the thirst center of the body, which will basically make the feeling of thirst for that person. Okay. So two main, most important information for you guys to know that it's diabetes insipidus is if we have high plasma osmolarity, because of course not a lot of water is staying in the body, so the plasma will be very concentrated. And then if we have very low urine osmolarity, meaning that the urine is very diluted. Okay, and it's going to be caused by tumors or just damage to the hypothalamus or the posterior pituitary. The second case is symptom of inappropriate ADH secretion. And it's basically when we have a lot of ADH secreted. So what happens is that a lot of water will be retained in the body. So what happens is we have fluid retention. And then there's also other features which include headache, disorientation, weight gain, and low blood solute concentration, because the blood's going to be very diluted. So the two features are low plasma osmolarity, because we have a lot of ADH, a lot of water, so the ratio of water, so basically the amount of water to solutes that we have in the plasma will be very, more water compared to solutes, and then the urine will be very concentrated. And yeah, the causes for this could include meningitis in children, or if we have any damage to the hypothalamus and the pituitary, and then also in cancer, where cancer cells are basically a source of even more ADH. Does anyone have any question about this part? Now I have a question for you guys. So, can anyone read the question, please? Okay, who was the first one to answer? I think it was. Okay, can you please answer? What do you think the answer is? Yeah.
Decreased oxytocin.
Exactly, perfect. Because the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract is responsible for the secretion of hormones from the posterior pituitary. So of course it's going to be anything related to hormones from the posterior pituitary. The other hormones are not from the posterior pituitary. So yeah, it's clear, right? You got to repeat. Okay. Another question. So a patient receives general anesthesia and afterwards develops headache and mild confusion. Labs show hyponatremia and concentrated urine. Which mechanism explains these findings? Now, let's first break down the question. Okay, do you want to answer? Shorook? Yeah.
I think it's 8.
Sorry?
Is it 8?
A? You're correct. So basically, guys, it's really important. Hyponatremia is when you have low sodium concentration. Okay? So if you have low sodium concentration, it's basically when you have a lot of ADH because there's a lot of water. So compared to sodium, the water levels are high, and yeah. Does anyone have any question about the other options? Okay. Great. Now for the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is also called adenohypophysis. Adeno from the adeno means gland, hypophysis pituitary. Okay, so the anterior pituitary, unlike the posterior pituitary, is not connected to the hypothalamus through neurons. It's connected to it through blood, through a system called the hypophyseal portal system. Okay, and I'll come to that in a second. The anterior pituitary also is not made of neural tissue. It's made of glandular tissue, which means that it produces and secretes its own hormones. Okay? So in the posterior pituitary, remember, it does not produce its own hormones. The anterior pituitary does. Okay, and the fact that it's glandular tissue arises from the embryological origin. So just a quick background for you guys. During the development of the embryo, the anterior pituitary actually develops from the roof of the mouth. So it goes upwards and it connects to the posterior pituitary. Once it connects to it, it loses its connection with the mouth. And that's why it's not actually connected to the hypothalamus through neurons. It's actually made up of glandular tissue that produces and secretes its own hormones. Now, the anterior pituitary produces and releases 6 different hormones. All of the hormones except for growth hormone and prolactin are tropic hormones. Do you guys know what a tropic hormone is? A tropic hormone is basically one that does not act on the target organ itself, it acts on another gland. Okay? And we're going to explain how it works when we come to each hormone. However, growth hormone, prolactin, they have direct effects where they act on the actual target cells and target tissues. Okay? Now, the anterior pituitary, again, it's part of the pituitary, so it's controlled by the hypothalamus. The way it's controlled, however, is through blood. So the hypothalamus produces hormones, which are releasing and inhibiting hormones. They will travel down the hypophyseal portal system into the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary will secrete its own hormones. So if you look at this figure here, the hypothalamus will release hormones, so either releasing hormones, which will stimulate the secretion of hormones from the anterior pituitary, or inhibiting hormones. These hormones will travel into the primary capillary plexus. Now, before I continue, I mentioned the hypophyseal portal system. The hypophyseal portal system is made up of the primary capillary plexus, the hypophyseal portal veins, and a secondary capillary plexus. Now, it's a special system because 2 capillaries are connected by veins. This is very important because the hypothalamus will secrete hormones, and we want these hormones to not get diluted by the systemic circulation. So they will be secreted directly into the veins, but it will act straight away on the pituitary without going into the systemic circulation. Alright? So yeah, the hypothalamus will secrete hormones. They will enter the primary capillary plexus. They will travel down to the hypophyseal portal veins, where they will stimulate the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary will then, in response, secrete hormones. They will enter the secondary capillary plexus, where they will enter the systemic circulation and will act on target cells. Is this clear? Okay. actually in the anterior pituitary. Okay, so unlike the posterior pituitary where the hypothalamus grows. And growth hormone is an anabolic hormone, meaning it wants to build tissue. And this will be reflected in the functions of the growth hormone, which we will talk about again in a second. So the hypothalamus again will control growth hormone secretion. There are two hormones that are secreted by the hypothalamus that stimulate or that regulate growth hormone production. This includes growth hormone inhibiting hormone. From the name, it inhibits growth hormone secretion. And then growth hormone releasing hormone, which stimulates growth hormone secretion. Growth hormone inhibiting hormone is also called somatostatin. Now, just a quick, tip for you guys. Statin usually means it stops. So growth hormone inhibiting hormone, somatostatin, it stops growth hormone secretion. Okay. Now, one thing to mention is that the secretion of growth hormone is the highest during sleep, and it also increases from when you're a baby until adolescence, and after that it decreases. Now, since it peaks during sleep, this is why we always emphasize on how children should get a lot of sleep, because we want children to grow, of course, we want them to develop. So in order for them to grow, we need a lot of growth hormone, and so we need a lot. So the highest amounts of growth hormone are during sleep. So if they get more sleep, there's more growth hormone, and they will actually develop more growth hormone. Okay. I will come to the last point in a second. Okay. So for the functions of growth hormone, the direct actions, it means that it will affect the energy metabolism in the body. Now, whenever we think of energy, the first thing we should think of is glucose. Okay. Growth hormone is actually kind of special because it wants to save glucose. It wants to increase the amount of glucose in the blood, but it doesn't want the cells to use it yet. It wants to save them for the brain and more vital organs, the brain and the heart. Okay? So instead, it will stimulate the breakdown of fats so that we can use the fatty acids for energy instead of glucose. So yeah, as you can see, it increases fat breakdown. It decreases the glucose uptake by cells. Okay? And it increases blood glucose. So again, the levels of glucose in the blood will be high, but we do not want the cells to use this glucose. And this effect is actually called the anti-insulin effect. Now we know insulin, which Habiba will come to in a second. Insulin wants to decrease glucose levels. Growth hormone does the opposite. It wants to increase glucose levels and wants to maintain high glucose levels in the blood. Okay? And it also increases amino acid uptake and protein synthesis because we can also use these amino acids for energy instead of glucose. Now for the indirect effects or actions, these are the ones that are mostly responsible for the growth that you see that growth hormone does. So the first most important point is that growth hormone stimulates the production of insulin-like growth factors. These insulin-like growth factors promote, number one, the uptake of nutrients, because if we want growth, we need a lot of nutrients, of course, for the cells. So that's one point. It increases protein and DNA synthesis. It increases cell division. And it also increases collagen formation as well as bone matrix deposition. Now, the two main targets for growth hormone, the insulin-like growth factors that are produced by growth hormone are bones and skeletal muscle. So it will increase bone length, okay, and it will also increase the muscle mass. And yeah, now insulin-like growth factors, they can be produced by different areas in the body. Number one is the liver. The insulin-like growth factors produced by the liver actually act as a hormone, so they travel into blood and will act on different faraway organs. And then it can also be produced by the bone, muscles, and other tissues, where it will have a paracrine effect, which Habiba explained to you guys earlier. Okay. Now for the disorders, yes?
Does growth hormone require thyroxine to bind to the cell before it acts upon it?
Thyroxine for growth hormone? Like, you mean synergism? Habiba, does it? Okay. I'll double check honestly, but I don't remember hearing that. I'll double check at the end of the session. I'll answer your question.
The thyroxine has a permissive effect on the gonadal hormones.
Yeah, if I remember correctly. It's thyroid, it's You'll take that next year, but for your information, this is the area in the bone that is responsible for the increase in length of the bone. Now, after puberty, the epiphyseal plates close, so we can no longer grow in length. But before, so during children, growth hormone can still act on the bone to make it can increase in length. So let's talk about hypersecretion. If you have a lot of growth hormone secretion in children where they can still grow, leads to gigantism, where the entire body is large in size, because growth hormone acts on all of the cells in the body and all of the bones and muscles, and they will just be larger than normal. So as you can see in this picture. However, if it's in adults, the epiphyseal plates, or the areas in the bone that are responsible for increase in length, are closed. So we can no longer increase in length of a bone. So instead, growth hormone will increase in the thickening of the bone, and it will also mainly act on extremities, so the face, the hands, and the feet. So as you can see in this picture, the body is not proportionate, unlike in gigantism. Now for hypersecretion, again in children, low growth hormone levels, the entire body will just be smaller in size. And that is called pituitary dwarfism. Pituitary because it's due to a pituitary disorder, which is where growth hormone is secreted from. And in adults, low levels of growth hormone doesn't really have a significant effect because we're not really expecting it to go in length. Okay, now I have a question for you guys. A man presents with acromegaly due to a growth hormone secreting pituitary adenoma. Which feedback mechanism is most responsible for suppressing endogenous growth hormone secretion? I'll give you guys some time. Okay.
Is it E?
Okay. Let's first break down the question. Okay. So we have a tumor in the pituitary gland. Okay, and we have acromegaly. Acromegaly is when we have a lot of growth hormone, right? Now, if we have a lot of growth hormone, we will have a lot of insulin-like growth factors. Okay? Now, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, I think I missed it. But basically, insulin-like growth factors and growth hormone, if we have adequate amounts, they will act on the hypothalamus to prevent even more secretion of growth hormone. However, here we have an exogenous source of growth hormone. Okay? So what's responsible for suppressing the growth hormone that actually comes from the anterior pituitary is the inhibition that insulin-like growth factors does on growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. Was that clear? I'm willing to re-explain because this is a bit confusing.
Can you repeat it?
Okay, so I'll just read the question here, okay? A man presents with acromegaly due to a growth hormone secreting pituitary adenoma, okay? So we have a tumor in the pituitary which secretes a lot of growth hormone, and that leads to acromegaly. Now, whenever we have hormone secretion, if we have adequate amounts, this should feed back to inhibit the initial stimulus. Now remember, anterior pituitary is controlled by the hypothalamus, right? So the hypothalamus secretes growth hormone releasing hormone, which stimulates the production of growth hormone, and then that also stimulates production of insulin-like growth factors. So if we have a lot of growth hormone, we will also have a lot of insulin-like growth factors. These insulin-like growth factors should go back and inhibit growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. And this is basically the feedback mechanism here. Was it clear? Okay, perfect. Okay. Now, thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone is also called thyrotropin, and it's a tropic hormone. So again, it does not act on the target, it acts on another gland, which is the thyroid gland, which Habiba will explain again in a second. So thyroid stimulating hormone, it will stimulate the growth of the thyroid, as well as, from the name, it will stimulate the secretion of hormones from the thyroid gland. Okay? And again, it follows the hypothalamic pituitary target endocrine loop. So I have it here for you guys, okay? So we have hypothalamus. Hypothalamus will secrete thyrotropin releasing hormone. Okay, so from the name, thyrotropin is thyroid stimulating hormone. So it stimulates the release of thyroid stimulating hormone. So again, the hypothalamus will secrete thyrotropin releasing hormone. It will act on the anterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary will then secrete thyroid stimulating hormone, and this will act on the thyroid gland. Thyroid gland will then secrete the thyroid hormones. Now, if we have enough thyroid hormones, these hormones will feed back, so they will go back to inhibit the secretion of thyrotropin releasing hormone and thyroid stimulating not want excess hormone levels in the body. Is that clear? Okay. The other hormone is adrenocorticotropic hormone. It's also called corticotropin, okay? And it's secreted by corticotropic cells in the anterior pituitary. And again, it's a tropic hormone because it acts on the adrenal glands, doesn't act on the target cells straight away. And it's actually produced from a larger precursor, which is called pro-opiomelanocortin. You guys just have to memorize that, okay? So it simulates the release of corticosteroids. Corticosteroids are the hormones that the adrenal gland produces. And one very important piece of information is that when we have a lot of adrenocorticotropic hormone, it will stimulate certain cells called melanocytes. I think you guys already took that. It will stimulate the secretion of melanin from melanocytes. And this will be reflected in one of the disorders of the adrenal gland, which we will come to in a minute. Okay? So again, the hypothalamus, we'll always start with the hypothalamus because it controls the anterior pituitary. So the hypothalamus will secrete corticotropin releasing hormone. Corticotropin releasing hormone will act on the anterior pituitary to produce adrenocorticotropic hormone, which will act on the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands will then secrete corticosteroids, which are the adrenal hormones. We will explain that in a second. And that will act on target cells. Now again, if we have enough corticosteroids, enough adrenal hormones, we do not want excess, so we need to stop excess secretion. How do we do that? We go back and we inhibit the hypothalamus to secrete corticotropin releasing hormone, as well as the anterior pituitary from releasing adrenocorticotropic hormone. Guys, was that clear? Okay, great. So the triggers or things that stimulate adrenocorticotropic hormone secretion is fever, hypoglycemia, or just any stressors in general. So fever is a physiological stressor. We're going to talk about this in more details when we reach the adrenal gland in a second. Before we move on, as you can see in this picture here, adrenocorticotropic hormone follows a circadian rhythm, so a daily rhythm. The highest levels are right before you wake up. Now, I don't know if you guys noticed, but when you wake up, you're usually the most stressed. This is because adrenocorticotropic hormone levels are actually the highest. And then the levels are lowest right before you sleep. Okay. Now for gonadotropins. Gonadotropins, again, they're because they're from the anterior pituitary, they are regulated by the hypothalamus, and the hormone responsible here is gonadotropin releasing hormone. So it stimulates the production of gonadotropins. There are two gonadotropins that we know: follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates gamete production. So that includes sperm and oocytes. And luteinizing hormone stimulates the secretion of gonadal hormones. So these are testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. Now in females, it's a little bit more detailed. The luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone, they both act together to mature a follicle. And then luteinizing hormone also triggers ovulation. But I think this is all you guys need to know for your chapter because this is an endocrine chapter, not a chapter about the reproductive system. Okay? Now, before puberty, the levels of these gonadotropins are very, very low. They're practically absent. After puberty, they will rise, and that will trigger the maturation of the gonads. So again, let's look at the loop. We have the hypothalamus. It produces gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which acts on the anterior pituitary to secrete follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which are the gonadotropins. They will act on the gonads, and the gonads will then secrete hormones in response. And this again will feed back to inhibit the hypothalamus from secreting gonadotropin-releasing hormone and the anterior pituitary from secreting luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating. Was that clear? Okay, great. Last but not least, we have prolactin. Prolactin stimulates the production of milk. Now, earlier we talked about a hormone that stimulates the ejection of milk. Do you guys remember what it was? Oxytocin. Exactly. Prolactin acts on certain cells in the mammary glands that actually produce the milk. Okay, so it's most important in nursing women who want to breastfeed. Okay, so it's produced by prolactin cells. It stimulates milk production. And a very interesting thing about prolactin is that the main form of regulation is through inhibition by a hormone called prolactin inhibiting hormone, which is also called dopamine. So if you think about it, if we have a lot of dopamine, will we have very high or very less prolactin?
Less.
Exactly, because it inhibits prolactin release. Okay. Now, in estrogen, in females, estrogen increases prolactin levels, and during pregnancy, we will have high prolactin to enable milk certain drugs that can be prescribed. If you have a lot of dopamine inhibitors, so they inhibit dopamine. Dopamine inhibits prolactin. So if you have a lot of dopamine inhibitors, the prolactin levels will be very high because we're losing the inhibition that dopamine does on prolactin. Okay? Oh yeah, and there are different clinical signs: incomplete lactation, amenorrhea, which is the loss of menstrual periods, infertility, and impotence in males. So here I have the loop for you guys. Thyrotropin. Okay. So we said the main form of regulation is through dopamine, which inhibits the secretion of prolactin. We also have thyrotropin releasing hormone. It stimulates, but its effect is minor. So the main one for regulation of prolactin is through dopamine, which inhibits. Okay. So now prolactin will then be secreted from the anterior pituitary to act on mammary glands, where it will stimulate the production of milk. And then we have, if we have more suckling, we'll have more prolactin levels, and the positive loop goes on. Okay. So I have a question for you guys. A patient suffers ischemic damage limited to the primary capillary plexus of the hypothalamic hypophyseal cortical system. Which hormonal change is most likely? Yeah?
E?
Sorry?
E?
E? Do you want to question again?
What you said primary.
Basically, the
Is this the
hypophyseal
first?
cortical system is for the anterior pituitary, right? If it's damaged, any hormones from the hypothalamus will not be able to reach the anterior pituitary. And so we will not have a lot of anterior pituitary hormones that will be secreted. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. Does anyone have any questions about any of the other options? So for example, oxytocin is obviously not this answer because it's produced by the posterior pituitary, not the anterior pituitary. Again, antidiuretic hormone is also produced by the posterior, not the anterior pituitary. And we will actually have effective pituitary function because the system that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary is damaged for the anterior pituitary, and so the anterior pituitary hormones will be low. Okay? Okay, perfect. Another question. A pregnant woman near the end of gestation has markedly elevated blood levels of a hormone produced by prolactin cells of the anterior pituitary, making milk production possible. After delivery, the infant suckles normally, but milk does not enter the infant's mouth. Which of the following best explains this finding? Okay,
B?
you're correct. So here, what is the hormone that stimulates the myoepithelial cells? Exactly. So here we have enough milk produced, but the problem is the release of the milk, which is controlled by oxytocin. Now, oh yeah.
I have a question for the question that was before this one. What will happen if there is damage to the secondary capillary plexus?
So the secondary capillary plexus is responsible for transporting the hormones produced by the anterior pituitary to the target. So we could have high levels of anterior pituitary hormones, but mainly the secondary capillary plexus, okay? But these hormones will not be able to act on the target organs because the secondary capillary plexus, when the hormones in that plexus, which is a network of capillaries, they will go to the systemic circulation. But if the secondary capillary plexus is damaged, these hormones cannot go into the circulation, so they cannot exert their effect. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
If the primary is damaged or blocked,
Yes.
they still can release LV hormone to the rest of the body.
Everything will be cut off.
We won't have.
You want that?
Basically, it's wait. Let me go to the figure. Yeah. So the hypothalamus will secrete hormones that regulate the release of anterior pituitary hormones. Okay. These hormones. So let's say, for example, growth hormone releasing hormone. It will stimulate the release of growth hormone. This growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus will enter the primary capillary plexus. From there, so we're still in the infundibulum. We didn't reach the anterior pituitary. Okay. From there, it will travel down the hypophyseal cortical veins into the anterior pituitary. These hormones will act on the anterior pituitary. So the growth hormone releasing hormone will stimulate the release of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary. In response, we will get growth hormone. Now, if this primary capillary plexus is damaged, growth hormone releasing hormone
gland, and it's located in the anterior neck. So I have my neck here. It's in front, like in the anterior side, and it is lying on the trachea, just inferior to the neck. So we have the larynx, then trachea. It is like right under the trachea, the larynx, and on top of the trachea in the anterior side of the neck. It consists of two lobes. It's shaped like a butterfly, and the connection in the middle is called the isthmus. Okay. Now, in general characteristics of the thyroid gland, it is the largest pure endocrine gland in the body. It is highly vascularized, supplied by two very richly supplied blood vessels. Those are the superior and inferior thyroid arteries. And that's why a surgery in the thyroid gland is very difficult and very bloody and very painful. Internal structure, basically, I want to draw this one. So, we have a follicle, okay, a very big circle. Can you guys see? Is it okay? Okay. We have a follicle, and then these cells are on the border. They are called the follicular cells. Okay? They're cells. Inside, we have the colloid, and it is yellow in color. Here, we have the blood vessel. Okay, this is the general structure. The follicular cells, they can be either squamous or cuboidal. Okay? Here, when we discuss about how the thyroid hormone is formed, we're going to find out what's the function of each component of itself. Okay. Now, as I said, the follicular cells, they are cuboidal or squamous cells, and the functions is that they produce thyroglobulin, which is a glycoprotein. When they enter, the thyroglobulin will get iodinated here. So say here, thyroglobulin. Once it enters here, it will become thyroglobulin attached to iodine. I will explain the process. And then when we want to release it into the blood, we remove the thyroid, and we keep the iodine attached to thyroxine. Thyroxine is part of the thyroglobulin. Okay, so the colloid, it is the follicular lumen. It contains the thyroglobulin molecules attached to iodine atoms. Parafollicular cells. Now this is the follicle, okay? Parafollicular means beside the follicle. So outside of the follicle, we have here outside parafollicular cells, okay? So what do these do? They release calcitonin. We will discuss the function of calcitonin as well. And not only are they in the surrounding, they can also be attached to the surface of the follicle, which are the follicular cells. They can be either attached to them or between the spaces between the different or the separate follicular follicles. Okay, so in thyroid hormone, we have two thyroid hormones. We have thyroxine or T4 and triiodothyronine or T3. Which one is the active one? It is the T3. The T4, it is majority of the thyroxine hormone that is released from the thyroid gland is actually T4. And T4, because it's the inactive form, it gets converted into the triiodothyronine at the target organ or the target cell. They have receptors that will convert this into this. The features that they have in common is that basically they both have iodines, and the subscript number, it represents the number of iodine atoms that are bound to the thyroglobulin molecule. So here in the T4 we have 4 iodine atoms attached, and the T3 we have 3 iodine atoms attached. Okay. So now thyroid hormone, thyroxine hormone. A thing about it is that it's an amino acid. It's amino acid derived, so that means it's a protein. It should be unbound in the blood. But however, it's an exception because even though it is an amino acid hormone, it is derived from an amino acid thyroxine, it acts as a steroid hormone. Okay. So what does this entail? Is that the hormone will enter inside the target cell. It won't bind to the receptor on top of the cell. It will enter inside the cell. And inside the cell, on the wall of the nucleus, we have receptors that they will bind to, and they will activate the gene transcription to mRNA, okay? And this leads to new protein synthesis. Now, the major effects of the thyroid hormone, it's like the pedal of the body. You are stimulating many things to happen that have to do with development, the blood pressure, the heat, metabolism, cholinergic effects. Cholinergic means heat producing. So it has a heat producing effect. Actually, heat production means calorogenic. This is a key word, you need to know it. Metabolism, it stimulates the basal metabolic rate, heat production, growth and development. So in kids, like when it's stimulated, it's really important for their early development of the brain, the skeletal muscles, the bones, everything needs this growth the thyroid hormone. And coming back to your question, you also asked about this, it does have a permissive effect. So the growth hormone, in order for it to have an effect and make the children grow, thyroxine has to be there and allowed to happen, allowed to have effect. Now, the third effect of the thyroid hormone is the blood pressure regulation. So whenever it is secreted, the adrenergic receptors in the blood vessels, they increase, and this leads to an increased contraction of the muscles, of the smooth muscles around the blood vessels, increasing the blood pressure as they contract. The unique feature of the thyroid gland is that the thyroid hormone, once it's produced, it can be stored extracellularly in the colloid. So here we said there is thyroglobulin, it will enter. Here the thyroxine that forms here, it can stay inside the colloid until it is used by the body. And this is a unique feature for the thyroid hormone because in most of the other glands, once the hormone is secreted, it directly goes to the blood to the target organ. But in thyroid, it can be stored in amounts sufficient to 2 to 3 months. Okay? The TSH regulation is basically immediate release of the stored thyroid hormone and stimulation of the hormone. So basically, when we need that thyroid hormone, when the thyroid hormone receives the signal that we are in need of that hormone, the first thing that it will do is release the stored thyroxine. After it is released and the body had sufficient amount of that thyroxine and it even needs more than that, more than the stored, that's when the follicles start to produce more thyroxine to supply the body. Now the steps of the thyroid hormone synthesis, I also want to explain it here on the board. Yeah, I think this is my turn. Okay, so here we have, this is the follicular cell, okay? This is the colloid, and this is the blood vessel. Step number 1. Follicular cell. Now we imagine where the follicular cell's position is, right? We have a circle, the follicular cells here, colloid here, and here is the blood vessel, okay? So what happens is the follicular cell, it will synthesize thyroglobulin. Thyroglobulin, okay? Now, once this is secreted, it goes into the colloid, okay? Here we will have the thyroglobulin. Okay, so this is the first step. The second step, the follicular cell, it will take iodide ions. In the blood vessel, we have iodide ions. It will take it up by active transport. We need a protein transporter for this. So the iodide ions will enter here, and then it will go here, and then here it will go to the colloid. On this border, we got a question about this. They asked about the location where the iodide ions are converted into iodine by oxidation reaction by reducing electrons. It's at the border between the colloid and the follicular cell. This is the position where this happens. So when it enters here, an oxidation reaction happens, and we end up with iodine, okay? At this stage, what happens? We have the thyroglobulin, we have the iodine inside the colloid, okay? They will combine by an enzyme called what? Peroxisome. Now the way you can remember this is that we are pairing the iodine with the thyroglobulin. So that pairing process is catalyzed by the peroxisome enzyme. So here, peroxisome. Okay? So when we do this, the thyroglobulin, tyrosine inside it. It is within the structure, a tyrosine. The iodine, it combines with this tyrosine inside the thyroglobulin. It will give us one of two things: monoiodotyrosine or diiodotyrosine. Okay, what is the difference? Diiodotyrosine, it means that two iodine atoms have been attached to the tyrosine inside of the thyroglobulin. When only one is attached to the tyrosine inside of the thyroglobulin, that's going to be mono. So mono IT or DIT. Okay, now we have these. What do we do with these? We combine them. Okay, so I will explain whatever happens here over there because I don't have space. I'll explain here. Okay, so MIT plus MIT plus DIT equals T3, okay? And DIT plus DIT equals T4. This is thyroxine, and this is triiodothyronine, okay? At this stage, so here we have T3 plus T4. Do you guys understand so far?
Yes.
Okay, now T3 and T4, they are still incorporated within the thyroglobulin. We didn't remove it yet. So what's going to happen at this stage, this will go here. By endocytosis, it will enter the follicular cell again. Okay, it goes here. So here we will have a vesicle. It contains T3 plus T4, still incorporated inside the thyroglobulin molecule. What will happen here? Inside the follicular cell, cells usually have a sacs of lysosomes to break down stuff. So here we have lysosomes. They will combine with this, remove the thyroglobulin, they will remove the thyroglobulin from here, and we're gonna end up with the tyrosine attached to the iodine, either 3 iodines or 4 iodines. And those at the final T3 and T4 are going to be, by exocytosis, released into the blood as T3 plus T4, and then they will go to their target organs. Is that clear? Okay, so this basically explains everything I've said. Coupling DIT plus DIT equals T4, MIT plus DIT equals T3. Hormones remain bound to the thyroglobulin in the colloid, and then we said by endocytosis it will enter the iodinated thyroglobulin, endocytosed to lysosomal fusion, so it will become inside a vesicle, inside of the follicular cell. In there, you're going to be combined with lysosomes, and those lysosomes, they will remove the thyroglobulin and leave the T-tyrosine attached to either 3 iodines or 4 iodines, forming the final hormonal products. Okay, Farah already explained the regulation by negative feedback. So the hypothalamus, it will release tropic hormone, which is the thyroid releasing hormone, okay? And then this will stimulate the anterior pituitary to release thyroxine stimulating hormone, will go to the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormones to the target cells. Once the thyroid hormones, they reach a specific level that we acquire, it will go back to inhibit both the release of the TSH and the TRH from hypothalamus and anterior pituitary to avoid overstimulation. Okay? Now the transport, as I've said, even though it's derived from thyroxine, as you guys have seen, it is still bound to a globulin in the blood. It doesn't get transported on its own. It has to be bound to a protein. That protein is called as thyroxine binding globulin, or TBG. And this protein is synthesized from the liver. It will go to the thyroid gland, it will take the products, it will transport them to the target organs. The binding increases the hormone stability and the half-life. One of the things that are the effect of binding or being part of a protein in the plasma is that it will increase the stability and half-life, meaning it survives for longer durations inside our blood and have a longer effect. T3 binds receptors more tightly, and that is why, as I've mentioned earlier, T4 is converted to T3 at the target cell, and the target cells are adapted in a way that they could do that. Okay. There is special regulation. The standard regulation is the one I've explained here, okay, by the negative feedback, it releases, And here, there is specific things that can also lead to an increase or the reduction in the production of thyroid hormone. exposure to infants. If a baby gets exposed to cold environment, immediately the brain will send impulses to the hypothalamus to release the tropic hormone TRH, to release more TSH, to release more thyroid hormone. And why do we do this? We want to increase the metabolism so that the baby wouldn't feel cold and actually have the metabolic activity hormone inside his body and produce more heat, warm himself. Inhibitors of TSH release, I've got a mnemonic for this. Stop the dead giant iodine. So each one will correspond to something. So the D is dopamine, glucocorticoids is the giant, and the iodine is the I, and finally S is somatostatin. Somatostatin means it's the same thing as GHIH, growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Another name for it is somatostatin. So this is how you guys can remember it. Okay. Now the parafollicular cells, they release calcitonin. Calcitonin is a peptide, okay? It is a protein hormone. It is released from the parafollicular cells. These cells. The cells, where did they go? Okay. Here. Say here. There's gonna be cells around it. These are the parafollicular. They release calcitonin. The calcitonin, what does it do? It's the opposite of parafollicular. So parafollicular is released when there is low amounts of calcium in the blood. Calcitonin is released when there is high calcium in the blood, and they intend to lower it back to normal levels. Now, scientists said that basically the calcitonin, they don't really have an effect on the human's body, and they have seen that when the thyroid hormone is removed, the absence of calcitonin doesn't really cause any effects, but it's only useful in one case, in therapeutic effects, where at high drug doses, the calcitonin is bone sparing, such as Pacademia's disease or osteoporosis. Basically, when there's holes in the bone because there's insufficient calcium and strong bone matrix to keep it compact, that's when we give therapeutic amounts of calcitonin to sequester more calcium inside the bone to rebuild the matrix and make sure it's strong. Hypothyroidism. Thyroidism increases the metabolic activity of the body. So when there is hypo, a decreased amount of thyroid hormone release, this leads to myxedema. Okay, myxedema is the most common condition where there is a reduction in the amount of thyroid hormone released. And the way you can remember it is that in myxedema there is an X, so you can remember X, that everything that is missing or stopped in the body. So you don't have any thyroid hormone released. You don't have any, when you look at this picture, you realize that, okay, thyroid hormone, because it is the fuel of the body. When it's absent, a person would experience mental sluggishness, depression, brain fog, they can't think properly, they're always cold, they have hair loss, they have puffy eyes. Basically, think about an extremely tired person that's extremely cold, and you just imagine all the symptoms. Okay, this is an explanation of why each of these symptoms happen. So, the first one basically is cold intolerance. Why is there cold intolerance? No thyroid hormone, so no stimulation of metabolic rate. So lower metabolic rate, a person feels more cold. And then lower ATP and CNS activity, also because of lower energy, leads to fatigue, lethargy. Lethargy means I can't think properly. It means brain fog. And then lower GI smooth muscle activity in the GI tract, because the muscles wouldn't have enough energy and are not stimulated to do their proper metabolic effects. They wouldn't be able to contract properly to move the food inside of the intestines, and this leads to constipation. Lower lipid metabolism, also because of the lower activity, so this leads to weight gain. And because of lower activity, the glycosaminoglycans, they are not transported to their proper locations, and so they accumulate in areas such as the back of the eye, lead to accumulation of basically glycosaminoglycans like lipids, and these will accumulate water, and that's why the person will have puffy eyes. Lower adrenergic receptors leads to bradycardia. Lower TH and lower TSH basically can also be caused by goiter. Goiter is one of the main reasons why hypothyroidism happens actually, is when we don't have iodine. So in this step, where we bind the iodine to thyroid hormone, it does not happen because we don't have iodine. And TSH will keep coming in attempt replacement to stimulate the cell because we need the thyroid hormone, but the thyroid gland is unable to release the hormone because we don't have the iodine to attach it to it. And so we can't release active hormones, and so the thyroid hormone will keep accumulating more non-functional thyroid hormones that wouldn't be released into the blood because they're not active. Everything clear? A treatment of adult myxedema can either be, as you might guess, because I said iodine can lead to the accumulation of non-functional thyroid hormone. We can take iodine supplementation only if goiter, only if it's deficit, only if goiter is the reason of hypothyroidism. The second thing is the thyroid hormone replacement. If the thyroid is defective and there is a problem in the thyroid gland itself, then it can't release the thyroid hormone, so we replace it completely. Okay, congenital hypothyroidism is basically when the baby is born with, it can be because of many reasons. The most common one is when the baby is born with non-functional thyroid hormone or smaller than its acquired size. That's why the baby would not be able to release enough thyroid hormone to supply its body, and that's why we can have signs like weak cry, poor feeding, constipation, prolonged jaundice. Because of the same thing, there's lower metabolism, so those things that are supposed to be there, they're not achieved by the baby's body. Newborn screening is essential. So what they're doing now is that whenever the baby is born, they take a screen of the baby to make sure that the thyroid gland is of the correct size and it's not small. Otherwise, we give the oral supplements to the baby of thyroid hormone, and if it was caught up early and you actually give the supplements to improve the baby's symptoms, later treatments would not be required. But if you postpone that to later and you don't actually give the medication to the baby, it can lead to lifelong therapy, or the person would require lifelong therapy of thyroid hormone. Like hyperparathyroidism, more metabolism, she's burning up, heating up, okay, then her eyes, ophthalmos, eyes protruding outwards because accumulation of fibers behind the eyes, higher metabolic rate, heat intolerance, sweating, rapid irregular heartbeat, nervousness. Why? Because again, the body's furnace is literally on. You have the thyroid gland, it is continuously stimulating the body cells to increase their metabolic rate, and this leads to a person feeling extremely hot the whole time. Like, we have a question here. A 28-year-old woman presents with weight loss despite high appetite, she eats a lot, palpitations, high heat intolerance, and protruding eyes. Laboratory results revealed elevated T4 and suppressed TSH. Which of the following best explains the pathophysiology of her disease? Okay, A. Autoantibody. Let's see. Yes, that's correct. Okay, do you guys understand why? Do you understand why? Should I explain? Okay, basically, she presents with weight loss despite high appetite, palpitations, and heat intolerance. That means she has high amount of thyroid hormone. When does this exactly happen? As I've said, in hyperthyroidism, where the antibodies, they mimic the TSH. We would have antibodies which normally would go and attack the thyroid gland, but instead of them going and attacking the thyroid gland, they mimic the role of TSH, okay? And they go and continuously stimulate the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone. And that is why she's experiencing those symptoms which happen because of increased metabolism. Is it clear? Do you understand? Okay, another question. A patient has a defect in the thyroid peroxidase pairing iodine with the thyroglobulin. The enzymes that mediates iodination, the thyroid biopsy shows normal colloid but low levels of T3 and T4 in the blood. Which step in the thyroid hormone synthesis is most directly impaired? Yeah?
That's it.
I don't think so, yeah. Okay, basically I said here that the peroxidase enzyme, do you remember what I said it does?
Yes.
Here? What does it do?
There's the MIT and DIT together to form T3.
No, the step before it. Iodine gets combined with thyroglobulin to form T3 and T4, which is still inactive. You have to remove the thyroglobulin from them after. So what happens? Do you get it now?
Yeah.
So the iodine here, I attaching to the thyroglobulin to form inactive T3 and T4. This is the step that is impaired. Okay? So that is why the coupling of MIT and DIT to form T4 and T3 and T4, which is the step after, it is not achieved because in the first place we did not even combine this to this. Do you get it?
Yeah.
Okay. Another question. A 35-year-old woman from a rural area presents with a painless swelling in the anterior neck. She reports fatigue, weight gain, and cold intolerance. Blood tests show low T4 and high TSH. Ultrasound reveals enlarged thyroid lobes filled with colloid. Which of the following best explains the thyroid enlargement? You can guess, it's fine. Okay, you. No one in the middle.
A.
Yeah, that's correct. Do you understand why?
Yeah.
Can you see?
He doesn't.
Huh?
Can you explain it, Sam?
Okay. So anterior and the swelling in the anterior neck. So we have high TSH, but even with that, there is low T4. Why do you think? There's no iodine.
Yeah.
So excessive stimulation by the TSH due to low iodine availability. What happens here is that TSH is coming from outside, okay? It's coming here. It's telling the thyroid cell to start producing a thyroid hormone, but it can't do that because there is no iodine. Iodine is absent. Because it's absent, we can't form the functional thyroid hormone. Okay?
Yeah.
Fine. Here we have the parathyroid. Parathyroid means behind the thyroid gland. So behind the thyroid gland, we have 2 to 8 dots of parathyroid hormone, and their color is basically yellow-brown glands. They're located at the back. So in this gland, we find 2 forms of cells, 2 types of cells. First one is oxyphil cells, and these we don't really know what the function of them is yet. The parathyroid cell is the focus of this part, where it secretes parathyroid hormone. The parathyroid hormone, it is the main controller of the levels of phosphate and calcium levels in the blood, where it's a protein hormone. This is really important. So parathyroid protein, PMP. Primary role is that it's the most important hormone controlling blood calcium levels and also phosphate. Why calcium controls matter? Because nerve impulse, it stimulates the nerve impulse. It is part of the blood clotting pathway, remember from the blood chapter, and muscle contraction. So regulation of PTH secretion, logically, low blood levels of calcium, it will release more PTH. Higher blood calcium, PTH, will be inhibited. So the parathyroid hormone's main function is to increase the amount of calcium in the blood. Okay, how does it act? It acts in one of 3 ways. The 3 target organs are the bones, the kidney, and the intestines. Our main aim is to higher the level of calcium. So how do we do this? We go to the bones, we tell the osteoclast activity to increase, and when this happens, the bone matrix will be broken down more to release more calcium into the blood, and as well as phosphate ions into the blood. Both will be released into the blood because our aim is again to increase the calcium levels. Now, after that, PTH release from the parathyroid hormone can go to the kidney, and it will tell the kidney tubules to reabsorb the calcium. Mesh at the glomerulus, we release all the contents from the blood. Now, when we are stimulated by the parathyroid hormone, it will go to the tubules and tell them, okay, bring this calcium back into the blood because we need it. The 3rd target organ is the intestines. Can it act on the intestines directly? No. It goes to the kidney first. It tells the kidney, so the effect of parathyroid hormone here is to convert the vitamin D from inactive to active form in the kidneys. When this happens, the active form of the vitamin D will go to the intestine, so the vitamin D will go to the intestine, and it will tell the intestine, please absorb more calcium. So here we absorb more calcium from the intestine. Here we reabsorb the calcium into the kidney tubules, and here we broke down the matrix of the bone to also sequester more calcium. All of this calcium goes to the blood, leading to the increase of the calcium in the blood. Okay, clear? Okay, so basically this is an image to make you remember. So the parathyroid hormone is the ground worker. He breaks down the bone. He goes to the kidneys, tells the kidneys, yalla, we want the calcium, he goes vitamin D converted into active form in the kidneys also, and then goes to the intestine to bring in more calcium. Right. Homeostatic imbalances, hyperparathyroidism. Parathyroid hormone, it increases the calcium levels in the blood. If we have an increased amount of parathyroid hormone, there will be an increased level of calcium in the blood. And what can this lead to? First of all, where are you taking the calcium from? You're taking it from the bones. So once you deplete more and more calcium from the matrix, it leads to the weakening of the bones, and the bone tissue, because there is no matrix, it will get replaced by fibrous connective tissue. So see, for example, on CT, on an X-ray, you will have here, for example, you see gaps. These gaps are the fibrous connective tissue that replace the matrix that has been depleted to facilitate more calcium. Bones appear moth-eaten on X-ray and they fracture really easily. Fracture easily, this is a keyword. You need to remember. Effect on blood and organs. Basically hypercalcemia. So hypercalcemia, we said calcium, it's important for three things. The neuron stimulation, the muscle contraction, and the blood clotting. So when we have more calcium, we are depressing the nervous system. Why? علشان in the neurons here, when we have like a neuron, the end of a neuron, and then presynaptic, postsynaptic, and we have here the neurotransmitters passing, right? The calcium that is around them, there's calcium around the neurons. This calcium is really, really important. Why? Because it stabilizes the environment around the neurons and allows the neurons to be only stimulated when it reaches the threshold. If we have less calcium, the neurons will be very sensitive to the neurotransmitters, and it will get activated a lot. And we will see this in the hypoparathyroidism, where there is a decrease in the amount of calcium, that there will be tetany, convulsions, like shivering, like random muscle jerks. That is because the neurons become more sensitive. So back to the topic, here we have high blood calcium. So because we have high blood calcium, that means that the nervous system is depressed. So instead of it being stimulated easily, it is stimulated very difficultly, and that's why there is abnormal reflexes and weak skeletal muscles. You can't really contract your muscles properly when you want to. Cause kidney stones. So basically calciums, where will they go, the extra calcium? They will go to the kidney, they will lay down there, can lead to kidney dysfunction, or they deposit in other places or other tissues, and they will also lead to the dysfunction of those tissues. Type. Hypoparathyroidism, it is the opposite. So parathyroid hormone, it increases the calcium. If we have less parathyroid hormone, we will have less increasing of the calcium. So insufficient calcium in the blood, low blood calcium, neurons become hyperexcitable. As I've said, when there is no calcium here, there is no stabilization. Anything that comes, it stimulates the sodium channels to open على طول and stimulates impulses. That's why it leads to tingling sensations, tetany, convulsions, tingling, things that have to do with the muscles, jerky movement that you don't really have control over, because the neurons are stimulated by the slightest thing. Severe or untreated cases, they can progress to respiratory paralysis and death. Why? Because if you cannot control your muscles, the respiratory tract organs are also not under your control, and this leads to paralysis and death, sometimes in severe cases. Okay. 38-year-old woman undergoes neck surgery to remove a thyroid nodule. A few hours later, she develops tingling sensations around her mouth and in her fingers, along with muscle cramps and spasms. She also mentions mild fatigue and nausea and says she skipped breakfast this morning. Which hormone disturbance is most likely possible? Yeah.
Speed.
Yeah, that's
Increase in
correct.
parathyroid.
Okay, clap for me. Okay, now, can you explain why?
She's shivering and tingling, yeah.
Yeah,
So it's
shivering, so uncontrolled muscle stimulation.
Yeah, which is
Uncontrolled
because
neuron stimulation means that the
decrease.
area around the neurons is not stable.
Hypoparathyroid.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Oh my god, did you guys see? Okay. Okay, fractures. Remember when I told you fractures is important? Stand نكمل السؤال. Fractures after minor bumps and a history of recurrent kidney stones. He also mentions fatigue and occasional constipation. He reports drinking coffee daily and exercising irregularly. Yes.
B.
Yes, that's correct. Now, can you say why?
Fractures. It's the key word because there is a lot of calcium being deposited into the blood from the bone.
As well as kidney stones.
That's correct. So more calcium, more kidney stones, more depositing. Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, guys. Now we're reaching towards the end. Now we're gonna talk about the adrenal glands. So as you can see in the picture here, the adrenal glands are secreted. They're located on top of the kidneys. Okay. So they can also be called suprarenal. Supra meaning above. Renal means kidney. So they are located on top of the kidney. Okay. We have two kidneys, so of course we're gonna have two adrenal glands. They're surrounded by a fibrous capsule and also by a cushion fat for protection and for protection from like physical injury and also from infections. Now the two main functions are electrolyte balance and stress control, both long term and short term, which we will talk about in details now. Now the adrenal gland, we have two areas in it: adrenal cortex, which is the outside area or the outermost area, and inside we have the adrenal medulla. Now, both of these, again, they have different functions and they have different origins, they secrete different hormones. So we can say that the adrenal gland is two different endocrine glands in one. So you get two in one, okay? So yeah, the adrenal cortex is made up of glandular tissue. So it has certain epithelial cells that produce and secrete its own hormones. It's derived from mesoderm, and the hormones that it secretes are called corticosteroids. Okay, so they are steroid-based hormones. They're lipid-soluble. There are three different types, which we will talk about in a second. The adrenal cortex hormones are mainly responsible for long-term stress management. Okay, and the stimulus for the adrenal cortex is mainly hormonal. So a hormone will stimulate the secretion of the adrenal cortex hormones. And then for the adrenal medulla, it's actually part of the sympathetic nervous system. Why? Because the cells in it are actually modified postganglionic neurons. This may seem a bit like tricky to digest, but they're basically neurons that are located in the adrenal medulla. Okay, so it actually contains neural tissue. The hormones that the adrenal medulla secretes are catecholamines. There are two: norepinephrine and epinephrine. We're gonna come to that in a second. The adrenal medulla's main function is to control the fight or flight response. Now, we all know the fight or flight response. So, like, yeah, if you're chased by a dog, for example, your fight or flight response will be activated. Now, since it's part of the nervous system, it has a neural stimulation. So, and usually like an action potential or something will stimulate the secretion of hormones from the adrenal medulla. Okay, so before we move on, let's look at the section from the adrenal medulla. This is a coronal section. So we have the capsule on top. We have the zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, zona reticularis, and then the adrenal medulla. So before I continue, the adrenal cortex itself is divided into three layers, which are the zona glomerulosa, fasciculata, and reticularis. Okay. Each one of these layers secretes different hormones. Now, if we start with the zona glomerulosa, as you can see, they're arranged in clusters. The cells are arranged in clusters. The zona fasciculata, they're arranged in long rods. And the zona reticularis, they're like arranged in a network, a meshwork, so no particular structure. Okay? So before I go into each one in detail, the zona glomerulosa mainly secretes mineralocorticoids. The zona fasciculata mainly secretes glucocorticoids, and the zona reticularis mainly secretes gonadotropins. I don't think you guys took this with the doctors yet, right? Exactly. So I'm aware that this is the first time you're hearing about this. Okay. Okay. So let's start with the zona glomerulosa. It's the first layer in the adrenal cortex. The cells are arranged in clusters, and the hormones that it secretes are mineralocorticoids. So from the name, you can kind of guess what it does. mineralo, so it controls the minerals in the blood. Corticoids, because it is a hormone secreted by the adrenal medulla, the adrenal cortex or the adrenal gland. And steroids, because it is lipid soluble, okay? The main hormone, so there are different mineralocorticoids. Well, the main hormone secreted is aldosterone, and it mainly affects the balance of sodium and water, so electrolytes and water, okay? The main electrolytes are sodium and potassium, and then of course, because we have these electrolytes, water is also affected, okay? So before I move on, you guys know that wherever sodium goes, water follows, right? So this is, just keep that in mind whenever we're talking about these hormones, okay? So aldosterone, it affects the electrolyte and fluid balance. Anything related to fluids, we're going to think of the kidneys. So the main target for aldosterone is the kidney tubules, where over there, aldosterone will stimulate sodium reabsorption, meaning we want to keep more sodium in the body. If sodium stays in the body, then it will drag water along with it. So more sodium reabsorption, so more water retention. And then it will also stimulate potassium excretion, as well as hydrogen excretion. Okay? So let's look at the effect of aldosterone on blood, basically. So in blood, after aldosterone, it will increase sodium levels, it will decrease potassium levels, it will decrease hydrogen levels. Now, if we have more sodium, we will have more water. If we have more water, what happens to the volume of blood?
Increase.
It will increase. If we have more blood volume, what happens to the blood pressure?
Increase.
It will probably increase. So, the overall effect is an increase in blood volume and blood pressure. Is that clear? Does anyone want to read? Okay, perfect. So the regulation of aldosterone is actually, we have many different mechanisms of regulation. These include the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone. Another one is potassium levels in the plasma. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, which, if you remember, is secreted by which gland? Adrenocorticotropic. Does anyone remember? And Syria, right? Yeah. And then also atrionatriuretic peptide. The two main ones are the first two, which are renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism and the concentration of concentration of potassium in plasma. Okay. Now, when we're talking about a stimulus for the secretion of a hormone, think of the actions it does, and if they're the opposite, of course we want aldosterone to be secreted, if that makes sense. So let me give you an example. So aldosterone wants to increase sodium reabsorption. So it wants to increase sodium levels, to increase blood volume and blood pressure. So if we have low blood pressure, of course we'll want more aldosterone to be secreted because it will act to increase blood pressure. And then low blood volume, low blood pressure, as well as high potassium levels in the blood. These all will increase aldosterone secretion because aldosterone increases the excretion or stimulates the excretion of potassium. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's talk about all of the mechanisms of regulation. The first one and most important one is the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. So let's start off with the stimulus. The original stimulus is low blood pressure or low blood volume. If we have low blood pressure or low blood volume, again, we're gonna go to the kidney. The kidney, certain kidney cells in an area of the kidney called the juxtaglomerular complex, they will detect the low blood pressure and low blood volume. In response, the kidney cells will secrete an enzyme called renin. Renin acts to convert angiotensinogen to angiotensin 2. And then angiotensin 2 will act on the adrenal glands, on the zona glomerulosa in particular, to secrete mineralocorticoids, mainly aldosterone. This is a lot of information. I know there's a lot of different hormones and glands and enzymes that you've never heard of before, but I'm willing to re-explain. But basically, angiotensinogen, it's an inactive precursor. Okay? Renin, which is secreted by the kidneys, activates it, and the active form is angiotensin 2. And then angiotensin 2 will act directly on the zona glomerulosa cells of the adrenal cortex to secrete aldosterone. Now, what will aldosterone do? It will increase sodium reabsorption, increase blood volume and blood pressure, and yeah, basically we will get of stress. It can be any form of stress, emotional stress, physiological stress, low blood pressure, whatever, okay? It will act on the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus will increase the secretion of corticotropin-releasing hormone, okay? Corticotropin-releasing hormone will then act on the anterior pituitary, which will secrete adrenocorticotropic hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone will then act on the adrenal glands, which will secrete aldosterone. And then aldosterone will increase sodium absorption, which will increase the water levels in the body. It will increase blood volume, which will increase blood pressure also. And then we will, like, the main function of increasing blood volume and blood pressure is to increase the nutrients and respiratory gases. Because now, what was the stimulus? High stress. Whenever the body is in a form of stress, the body will act to increase the levels of glucose, increase the levels of oxygen, nutrients, so that the cells can respond, mainly the brain and heart, okay? So, aldosterone here will increase blood volume so that we can have more nutrients and more oxygen to provide to the cells. Okay? Clear? Okay, perfect. Now the last one is interesting because it actually inhibits aldosterone secretion. All the ones we talked about, stimulated, okay? Adrenergic peptide, from the name, it's secreted by the atria of the heart, okay? So it's from the heart. It will be secreted when we have high blood pressure or high blood volume. Because of course, if we have high blood pressure and high blood volume, we do not want to make that even more. We do not want to have very high blood volume or very high blood pressure. So whenever we have high blood volume or high blood pressure, it will act on the heart to secrete, or it will stimulate the heart to secrete adrenergic peptide. Adrenergic peptide will then inhibit renin secretion, aldosterone secretion, or any angiotensin-induced mechanisms. Because all of these increase blood pressure and blood volume. Now we do not want that. And so the overall effect will be that the sodium levels will decrease, and so the blood pressure and blood volume will decrease. Is that clear, guys? Okay, perfect. Now, if we have very high levels of aldosterone, the disorder is called aldosteronism, okay? It's pretty obvious from the name. It will have two main effects. Now, let's think of the two ions that aldosterone mainly acts on, which is sodium and potassium. So for sodium, if we have very high aldosterone, we will have a lot of sodium reabsorption. So a lot of sodium will remain in the body, and so a lot of water will also remain in the body. So the sodium and water retention will be very high. What will that do? The blood pressure will be very high, and that leads to hypertension, which is high blood pressure. And then also it could lead to edema, which is accumulation of fluid in the body. And then the other effect is that it will increase potassium excretion. Okay, potassium is very important for the resting membrane potential, for muscle contraction. And so if we have high potassium excretion, the level of potassium in the blood will be very low. This is called hypocalcemia. Okay, it's not mentioned in the book, but you guys should know that low potassium levels in the body is hypocalcemia. Okay, in the blood. So now, if we have low potassium levels, it could lead to muscle weakness because we cannot reach the membrane potential. If you guys remember, resting membrane potential, and it could eventually lead to paralysis. Is that clear? Okay, and the causes could be adrenal tumors, of course, where the tumor is an extra source of aldosterone. Okay, I have a question here. A patient presents with low blood pressure after acute blood loss. Which of the following sequences best explains the initial stimulus leading to increased aldosterone secretion? I'll give you guys time because you just learned about this. Okay.
I think it's C.
C?
Yes.
You are correct. Because when we have low blood volume, we want to increase the blood volume. How do we do that? By renin. Who releases renin? Which organ? Do you remember?
Kidney.
Exactly. Perfect. Okay. Think about one question. Oh, okay. The questions are these. Now we have the zona fasciculata. We reached the second layer of the adrenal cortex. Okay? In the zona fasciculata, if you remember the picture, the cells are arranged in long rods. Okay? Now the zona fasciculata secretes hormones called glucocorticoids. Okay? So what it does is it increases blood glucose levels, it maintains blood pressure, and it helps the body cope with long-term stress. Okay? The glucocorticoids cross the plasma membrane, they can cross the nuclear membrane. So because they're able to do that, they can modify gene activity because they can enter the nucleus by crossing through the nuclear membrane. Okay? Now, how do you regulate glucocorticoid levels? We start with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus secretes corticotropin-releasing hormone. It will act on the anterior pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone will then act on the adrenal cortex to secrete cortisol, and then cortisol will exert its effects on the target organs. Now again, if we have enough cortisol, we do not want to keep cells in the body secreting cortisol. So we need negative feedback. The cortisol will act on both the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary to decrease the levels of corticotropin-releasing hormone and adrenocorticotropic hormone so that we can keep the cortisol levels regulated. Clear? Okay. Now again, same as adrenocorticotropic hormone, which I mentioned before. Cortisol also follows a circadian rhythm, so a daily rhythm. The highest levels are just before you wake up. So again, stress levels are highest in the morning, and then the lowest levels are just before you fall asleep. Does anyone have any question about this? Okay, perfect. Now, as we said, if we have high cortisol levels, it should feed back to inhibit the anterior pituitary and hypothalamus from secreting its hormones. However, if we have extreme stress, the regulation will be distorted, and the central nervous system will override the inhibition of cortisol. So cortisol is still inhibiting the anterior pituitary and hypothalamus, but from the central nervous system, there are signals to produce more corticotropin-releasing hormone, more adrenocorticotropic hormone, and more cortisol. And so, even though we have the inhibition, we still have the central nervous system that's stimulating the secretion of cortisol, and that leads to a massive cortisol release. And this is what happens during long-term stress. Was that clear? Does anyone agree? Okay, perfect. So let's look at the actions of glucocorticoids when we have normal levels. Okay? Again, we are thinking about long-term stress. So what do we need in the blood? We need high blood glucose. So it will increase blood glucose by many different mechanisms. So gluconeogenesis, which is the formation of glucose from non-carbohydrate components, glycogenolysis, etc. It will increase blood fatty acids so that we can use these fatty acids instead of the glucose for energy. Because remember, whenever we have a form of stress, the body wants to save the glucose for the most important organs, which are the brain and the heart. So it will increase blood glucose levels, and for the normal cells, it will use fatty acids for energy. It will increase blood amino acids, which could be used for gluconeogenesis, and then it will enhance vasoconstriction because it will want to increase blood pressure so that we have enough blood reaching the cells. Now, what happens in case of very high glucocorticoid levels? Two main effects: an anti-inflammatory effect and also anti-immune effects. And then also it will depress the bone formation, collagen formation, because basically what's happening here is the excess cortisol will act on the bone and cartilage to secrete, for example, amino acids. So the bone and cartilage will become very weak. Okay? And then it will also disrupt the normal function of the heart, the brain, and just the GIT in general. Now, certain drugs, such as the glucocorticoid drugs, can be given to some people. And yeah, so they can be used as a form of treatment, but we have to make sure that it does not reach excessive levels so that we do not have the unwanted effects. Now, this is Cushing's syndrome. In Cushing's syndrome, we have very high cortisol levels. So again, remember, if we have high cortisol levels, we will have anti-immune effects, anti-inflammatory effects, and fat redistribution. Before I break down this picture, let's just talk about Cushing's syndrome. So in Cushing's syndrome, the levels of glucose in the blood will be very, very high. This is called steroid diabetes. So again, diabetes when we have high blood glucose levels. Steroid diabetes because it's caused by a steroid hormone, which is cortisol. Okay? It will also increase protein catabolism so that we can use these amino acids to make more glucose by gluconeogenesis. So it will affect the muscles, it will affect the bones, muscles become weak, the bones will also become weak, and could lead to osteoporosis. And then it will also increase sodium and water retention so that we can have high blood pressure, but it's excess, so there's hypertension and edema. Now, it has many different causes. One important thing to mention is that if it's a tumor in the pituitary gland, the pituitary adenoma, it will not be called Cushing's syndrome, but it will be called Cushing's disease. Other causes include tumors in the lungs, pancreas, kidneys. These are extra sources of cortisol, and any other spots. So let's come back to this figure. We have fat redistribution. Okay, so it would lead to most of the fat being stored behind the neck, from the buffalo hump. We have around the abdomen and a moon face, and then anti-immune effects. So basically, if the person with Cushing's syndrome gets infected with a minor microbe or whatever, the infection will be very overwhelming for them because their immune system is depressed. And then also anti-inflammatory effects. So basically, if they get a scalp or a wound, the wound healing process will be not the best because cortisol is causing an anti-inflammatory effect on the body. And then bruising easily, weak muscles, we talked about that because of the protein metabolism. And yeah. Does anyone have any question about this? Okay. Now, Addison's disease is caused by low secretion of hormones from the zona glomerulosa, so mineralocorticoids, and hormones from the zona fasciculata, which are glucocorticoids. Okay, so basically, if we have low cortisol and low aldosterone, we will have Addison's disease. In Addison's disease, we have weight loss, we have low plasma levels of glucose, because remember, we have low cortisol. Cortisol increases blood glucose, but if we have low cortisol, the glucose levels will be low. Again, also we have low aldosterone. Aldosterone usually increases sodium levels, but since we have low aldosterone, the levels of sodium in the body will be very low, so low plasma sodium levels, and also we'll have high plasma potassium levels, because we do not have enough aldosterone to excrete the excess potassium. Now, since we will have low cortisol, low aldosterone, it will lead to severe dehydration, so we cannot control the amount of water in the body, and also hypertension, where there's low blood pressure because there's not enough water maintained in the body to have enough growth hormone and blood pressure. Now, remember when I mentioned that if we have high adrenocorticotropic hormone, it stimulates the melanocytes to secrete melanin, and that leads to a bronzing of skin. Now, let me explain this for you guys. Basically, in Addison's disease, we do not have enough cortisol, right? If we do not have enough cortisol, if you remember the negative feedback loop, in order for, okay, wait, never mind. So in the negative feedback loop, if we have high cortisol, the cortisol will feed back to inhibit corticotropin-releasing hormone and adrenocorticotropic hormone, right? In this case, we do not have cortisol. We do not have sufficient cortisol levels in the body. So we do not have a hormone that's inhibiting adrenocorticotropic hormone and corticotropin-releasing hormone. And so their levels will be very high. So we'll have high adrenocorticotropic hormone, which leads to bronzing of skin. Does that make sense? Okay, perfect. Now, treatment for Addison's disease includes corticosteroid replacement therapy, where you just give them the cortisol, for example. And yeah, that's pretty much it. The last layer of the adrenal cortex is the zona reticularis. Okay, it secretes gonadocorticoids. These are weak androgens, so their effect is not very strong. However, they can be used as precursors to produce testosterone and also to be converted into estrogen. Now, the main weak androgens include androstenedione and DHEA, which is dehydroepiandrosterone. Okay, so again, their effect is very weak, but they can be used as precursors for testosterone and estrogen. Their effect again is not that strong, but they do contribute to the luxury in pubic hair as well as the estrogen after menopause. Adrenocorticotropic hormone does stimulate the secretion of gonadocorticoids, but it's not very effective, and we do not have negative feedback by gonadocorticoids on adrenocorticotropic hormone. And again, if we have a disorder where we have high secretion of gonadocorticoids, it will lead to something called androgenital syndrome. Now, this is not very, not a problem in males because we have testosterone. However, it is a question about the adrenal cortex. So, a 56-year-old patient presents with persistent hypertension, peripheral edema, and muscle weakness. Laboratory studies reveal excessive urinary potassium loss. The most likely underlying mechanism involves increased activity in which of the following adrenal cortical zones? Yeah? B? B? B or?
Yeah, I think so.
Sorry?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, do you guys have an
It's C.
correct? Basically, it's okay, you just took this right now, you guys didn't study this earlier. The zona fasciculata, sorry, you said, what did you say, B, right? Yeah, zona fasciculata secretes gonadocorticoids, which are weak androgens, okay? In this case, we have, well, the main points here that will give out the answer is that we have hypertension, we have edema, and we have a lot of a lot of potassium in the urine. So basically, what's responsible for the control of potassium? Aldosterone. Aldosterone is secreted by the zona glomerulosa, the first layer of the adrenal cortex. And this is what answers the zona glomerulosa. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Perfect. And another question. A 38-year-old woman presents with chronic fatigue, weight loss, hypertension, and skin hyperpigmentation. This is important. Laboratory evaluation shows hyponatremia and hyperkalemia. Despite low plasma cortisol levels, adrenocorticotropic hormone remains persistently elevated. Which mechanism best explains the continued elevation of adrenocorticotropic hormone? Okay.
It's A.
A? Okay. Let's break down the question. Basically, we have hypertension, that's very important. We have skin hyperpigmentation. Remember when I mentioned high adrenocorticotropic hormone acts on the nanocytes, we have bonding in the skin? This gives you a clue. So we have high adrenocorticotropic hormone levels. And then we also have hyponatremia, that means low sodium levels in the blood, and hyperkalemia, which is high potassium levels in the blood. Now, the answer is the loss of corticosteroid-mediated negative feedback. Basically here, do we have enough cortisol in the blood?
No.
No. So
So
there's
some
not enough.
negative feedback.
Yeah,
some
the
forming
negative
a
feedback is
negative feedback.
effective. Exactly. So we
Oh,
would still
that's
have
right.
high adrenocorticotropic hormone. Does anyone know the name of the disorder here? Exactly, Addison's disease. So it's both low glucocorticoids and low mineralocorticoids. Yeah.
Doesn't the failure of cortisol also not in it doesn't perform a negative feedback?
Failure of cortisol synthesis. If we have no cortisol, we want more cortisol. So the hypothalamus will still be secreting corticotropin-releasing hormone, anterior pituitary will still be secreting adrenocorticotropic hormone. So we do not need the negative feedback here. The next we want more cortisol. Does that answer your question? I feel like wait. So low plasma cortisol levels. That means the cortisol levels in the plasma are low. Now one thing about questions in bio too is that you could have more than one answer is correct, but you have to make sure that it is correct in the case of the question. So here we have low plasma cortisol levels, so cortisol is low. They're asking which mechanism explains why we have high adrenocorticotropic hormone. If we have failure of cortisol synthesis in the zona fasciculata, that is why we have Addison's disease. But the reason why we do not have proper negative feedback is because, or the reason why we have still high adrenocorticotropic hormone is because we do not have cortisol to feedback to inhibit anterior pituitary. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Great. Now for the last part of the adrenal gland, the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla is actually part of the autonomic nervous system, so it contains modified neurons, basically. These neurons, which are the cells in the adrenal medulla, are called chromaffin cells, and they produce hormones called catecholamines. The two catecholamines are epinephrine and norepinephrine. The main one and the one that is secreted more is epinephrine. Okay? And this here shows you how exactly it's produced. So it starts off with tyrosine, which is converted to dopamine, and then norepinephrine, and then epinephrine. So it's responsible for the fight or flight response. Think of being chased by a lion or whatever, okay? Your blood glucose levels will be high. You will be tachycardic. You're going to be breathing a lot. Your blood pressure will be high. Your bronchi and your bronchioles will be dilated. Why? Because we want more oxygen to be able to flow into your blood. Metabolic rate will be increased so that we can have more glucose in the blood to provide for the organs and the cells, mainly the brain and the heart in this case. And blood is diverted away from unnecessary organs, which includes the skin, the GIT, to the heart and brain. And the skeletal muscles because we want to run away, okay? Now, epinephrine, we can use its effects in case of strong asthmatic attacks and allergic reactions. Because what does epinephrine do? It causes bronchodilation. In asthma, this will help ease the flow of oxygen and air basically into the lungs to get enough oxygen for the cells. And same for allergic reactions. Okay. Does anyone have any question about this? Okay. Now let's talk about the disorders. It's only one for the adrenal medulla. If we have hypersecretion of catecholamines, so very high levels of epinephrine and norepinephrine, we will have your body will basically stay in a form of stress. So you'll have uncontrolled sympathetic nervous system activation. Your blood glucose levels will be high. You will always have tachycardia, so high breathing rate. You will always have high blood pressure. And in this case, it's due to a chromaffin cell tumor. Remember, chromaffin cells are the cells in the adrenal medulla. And this tumor is called pheochromocytoma. It's for the adrenal medulla. And yeah, I think I have a question. Okay. A patient experiences recurrent episodes of hypertension, palpitations, and sweating. Imaging reveals a tumor of chromaffin cells. Which hormone predominates in secretion? Did you say something? See? That's exactly. Because chromaffin cells, adrenal medulla, nephrine, and norepinephrine. Okay? And yeah, now I'll talk to you. Thank you guys. That's it for me.
No, there's no, the last one is back to this.
Yeah, trying to wrap this up quickly. We have a pineal gland. It is a small endocrine gland hanging from the third ventricle of the brain, or the diencephalon, and it contains pinealocytes, and the two cells that we have, pinealocytes, and in addition to the pinealocytes, around them we have calcium sacs. We have sacs containing calcium around them, and this makes it flake or very visible on X-rays. It's because of these calcium salts, which helps us also to determine the orientation of the brain in the X-ray. So the pinealocytes, they release something called as the melatonin. And melatonin, it follows a daily rhythm. It increases at night, makes us drowsy, makes us sleepy, and it is very low, especially at the noon or like peak hours in the day. It is very low. Okay. So regulation, how it's regulated, basically, whenever we're exposed to sunlight or exposed to light, this will stimulate the retina. Retina will send impulses to the SCN, or suprachiasmatic nucleus, to the superior cervical ganglion, to the pineal gland. I know this is new, but it's really important to memorize this. And then once it reaches the pineal gland, and the pineal gland realizes that, okay, there is light stimulus, it will stop releasing melatonin. When there is no stimulation to the retina, the pineal gland will receive less impulses from the cervical ganglion, and when it receives less impulses, then it will secrete more melatonin. And melatonin makes us drowsy, and we feel like we want to sleep. Now the functions, basically, in addition to promoting sleep, we have other things, such as regulating the body temperature and appetite, mediate seasonal reproductive effects, such as in animals, and also in children, it has an anti-gonadotropic effect, where it stops precocious sexual maturation, where it basically regulates the exact time when the child will experience puberty, okay? It stimulates antioxidant and detoxification molecules. It's also one of the things. Okay, I have, okay, the answer showed. I'll explain the question and answer. An 11-year-old girl presents with delayed puberty. Her parents note she sleeps excessively at night and is very sensitive to light. Blood tests reveal elevated nocturnal melatonin levels. So because she sleeps a lot, okay, she has increased amount of melatonin, and because melatonin, one of the melatonin functions, as we mentioned in the previous slide, is to avoid precocious sexual maturity and maturation in the children. That's why when she has a lot of melatonin, she experiences puberty really late because melatonin suppresses puberty. Okay, is that clear? Okay, another question. A 40-year-old frequent traveler complains of disturbing sleep-wake cycles after flights crossing multiple time zones. He reports difficulty falling asleep at night in the new time zone. Bright morning sunlight exposure seems to improve his symptoms. Which of the following pathways is most directly involved in adjustment of his biological clock? Yeah?
A.
Yeah, that's correct. Okay, now moving on to the pancreas. I tried to simplify it to you guys. So imagine the pancreas as a pan. So in the pan, we have the oil. We're trying to fry an egg, okay? So in order to fry an egg, we need the oil. So the pan and then the oil. The oil contains what? The oil contains, what is the type of the cells? We have, what do we have? What's it called? Can you remember? Acinar cells, okay? So the oil is the acinar cells, and acinar reminds me of the word assassins. Assassins, they always have swords, they cut, okay? And because those swords they cut, it reminds me that those acinar cells, they will secrete the enzymes, the enzymatic secretions into the duodenum. So because the assassins, they break down, this will remind us of the enzymes. Okay, this is for the acinar cells, which represents the oil. Now in the middle of the oil, we have what? We have the egg. That egg is the islet of Langerhans. Islet of Langerhans has two types of cells, the alpha cells or the A cells and the beta cells. Alpha cells, they release glucagon. The way you can remember it is basically insulin does not have an A in the word. Alpha, the glucagon does. So alpha cells are the ones that will release the glucagon. And then beta cells, they will secrete the insulin. As you guys know, glucagon will increase the blood glucose and the insulin will lower the blood glucose, so hyperglycemic and hypoglycemic. Okay, so here's a depiction of what I said. So we have islet of Langerhans, we have alpha and beta cells, we have the glucagon producing, we have the insulin producing. Around them, we have the acinar cells or the assassin cells. They are exocrine because I said they secrete the enzymes into the duodenum through a duct. So that makes them exocrine cells. Okay, so glucagon, the major target of the glucagon is the liver. We said its main function is to increase the blood glucose. How can we do this? We will go to the liver, we will tell the liver, okay, now break down your glycogen because we need the glucose. So it will increase the glycogenolysis, increase the gluconeogenesis, which is the formation of glucose molecules from non-carbohydrate components. Say for example, lactic acid to glucose, for example. And then after that, it also increases the release of glucose into the blood, obviously. So we break down the glycogen, release glucose, glucose released into the blood. The secondary effects is that the things that also the glucagon has an effect on is that the amino acids, they will be taken up by the liver and they will be converted into glucose because we want to increase the glucose levels. So also something that will be seen is decreased blood amino acid levels. Insulin, primary effects, basically we lower the blood glucose. We're going to come back to that in the next slide. There are 3 ways in which we could achieve this. And then promotes protein synthesis and fat storage. So again, insulin, not only are we forming glycogen, we also form muscle. We take the amino acids form muscle, and we take the fatty acids and form fat. Okay. The secondary effects of this is that it increases the amino acid uptake, as I said, because we want to make muscle and we want to make fat. So amino acid uptake, more protein synthesis, more muscle formation, and so on and so forth. Okay. So insulin, the 3 ways in which it can reduce the blood levels is that it will take them up into the liver, decrease the glycogenolysis because we don't want glucose. We want to stop any process that leads to the increase of the levels of glucose. So we will stop glycogenolysis. we will stop gluconeogenesis, which is the formation of glucose from non-carbohydrate components. And I want you to remember something, that liver, kidney, and the brain, they do not need insulin to take up the glucose. And the way you could remember this is funny, but basically kids, they don't care what they eat because they don't care about weight gain or weight loss. So that's why we say kids, for kidney, they don't use their brain, they just live, okay? So kidney, brain, and liver, they take up glucose without any stimulation, okay? Now, regulation of the glucagon, obviously, glucagon is released when we want glucose, so it is stimulated to be released when there is less glucose. When there is high amino acids, because we want the amino acids to turn them to the glucose. It is inhibited by the increase of glucose, so if we have a high amount of glucose, why do we need the glycogen to even increase it more? That's why it inhibits it. Insulin, their antagonist hormone. Remember in the beginning of the session, I mentioned that glucagon and insulin are antagonists. So whenever we have insulin, it will inhibit the glucagon effect. And also, somatostatin. Somatostatin is common between two. Somatostatin is a hormone released by also a type of cell in the islet of Langerhans and the pancreas. And it stops everything, hormone. It stops the insulin and the glucagon, both. You find them both here. Okay. Insulin, it is stimulated. When do we need insulin? When we want to lower the blood glucose levels. So whenever we have high blood glucose, the secretion of insulin increases. Whenever we have high amino acids or fatty acids, also increases, because I said the secondary effect is that we form muscles and fat. So also when these are present, insulin will also be stimulated to be increased in higher amounts. And then parasympathetic stimulation. Parasympathetic is basically when the body relaxes. So when the body is relaxed, we don't really need the glucose, so we will take it up and store it. Okay? Hyperglycemic hormones, including glucocorticoids, growth hormone, all the things that actually need glucose, when they are released, this leads to an indirect stimulation of insulin. Is that part clear? Okay. Now, it is also inhibited by somatostatin and sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system means that we need more glucose. We are already activating metabolism. So that's why it inhibits insulin, because we want the glucose. We don't want the insulin to take it and store it. Okay. Because insulin is a protein, it binds to the tyrosine kinase receptor. It binds to the surface of the cell, activating a secondary messenger system. And then after that, the effects of the glucose, basically, the first effect of the insulin is that we actually use the glucose to form energy. After we've used all the glucose, if there is more glucose, then we increase the glycogen synthesis, we store the glucose because we no longer need it for ATP production. Once glycogen storage has exceeded the maximum level, then we increase glycogenesis, or the formation of fatty acids from glucose, and then fatty acids combine to form lipids. So these are the three effects of insulin once it's bound to its receptor. Okay, now insulin deficit, this is the homeostatic imbalance, is diabetes mellitus. There are two types of diabetes mellitus. The first type is when the insulin is not there, it is absent. This means there's a hyposecretion of insulin. The second type, the insulin is there, but it is ineffective, so the glucose cannot enter most cells. Both cases will lead to hyperglycemia because we can't take up the glucose and put it inside the cells. Okay. Now, cardinal signs of the condition, we have polyuria, polyphagia, and polydipsia. So let me explain why each one happens. Now, when you have less insulin, you are going to have high increased amount of glucose in the blood, okay? And this increased amount of glucose in the blood will go to the kidneys, it will get secreted in the kidneys, and then when it goes into the tubules forming the urine, it absorbs water with it, okay? So this leads to dehydration and lower blood volume, okay? Dehydration and lower blood volume, and the thing that we made, the urine that we made, because it contains a lot of glucose and it's absorbed water with it, that means we're gonna have polyuria, increased volume of urination, and then since we have a lower blood volume, the hypothalamus will sense that we have less water in the blood. That's why polydipsia happens. We become more thirsty. Okay? So dehydration will stimulate the thirst center activation, and this causes excessive thirst. Polyphagia, why? Because the glucose is continuously lost in the urine, and also you're breaking down the fat to compensate for that glucose that's lost in urine. That means that your body energy store is being depleted. So that's why you would feel hungry the whole time. It's like you have glucose but it's constantly getting rid of. You would need more energy, and that's why you're continuously hungry and need more fat and protein in your diet, so it increases the appetite. Okay, so this diagram is really important. It basically summarizes everything I've said. You can go through it on your own time. It summarizes everything about this. Okay, there is the opposite of this is hyperinsulinism, where excess insulin is produced. So hypoglycemia, we remove all the glucose from the blood and store it, and triggers hyperglycemic hormones. Those are the hyperglycemic hormones. So when we have less insulin, we will have less glucose in the blood, and that's why these hormones are released to trigger glucose release, an attempt to increase the glucose back up. And so we would have symptoms of anxiety because all of these hormones, cortisol, it is released in long-term stress conditions. Epinephrine, when you're stressed or when you need to focus, anything stimulates it. So these are the ones that stimulate things like anxiety, tremors, weakness. You're going to feel disorientation and seizures because you don't have enough glucose for your body to function properly. And it causes, the causes of insulin excess can be insulin overdose. The people who take insulin because they have hypersecretion of insulin, they take insulin. So sometimes they could overdose themselves, and this can lead to insulin excess and hence hyperinsulinism. Rarely, it can be caused by islet cell tumor. Okay, I have a question here. A newborn develops severe hypoglycemia shortly after birth. The infant is large for gestational age. What maternal condition most likely contributed to the presentation? Do you guys know?
Okay.
Okay. It is maternal diabetes mellitus. So again, diabetes mellitus, it is hyposecretion of insulin. So the mother doesn't have insulin, so she will have a lot of sugar in her blood. And because she has a lot of sugar in her blood and her blood is supplied to the child that's growing, that's why the growing baby will release more insulin, okay? And that's why when the body gets used to releasing more insulin, once the baby gets born, he will keep the high levels of insulin and maintains it, which leads to hypoglycemia. Okay, because there's high insulin, there's hypoglycemia because the sugars are taken into the cells. And why is he of large size for the gestational age? It is because he had received excessive amount of sugar from his mother, and that is why he has like higher body mass compared to average. Okay, here, a middle-aged patient presents with unexplained weight loss, mild diabetes, and muscle wasting. Blood glucose levels are persistently elevated despite low insulin levels. Which secretion of which hormone best explains this presentation is glucagon, because there is low insulin levels, but all of these symptoms are happening like weight loss and mild diabetes. It's because the glucagon is leading to the release of glucose, and so that it is not sequestered inside of the cells for the person to gain weight when they actually eat. That's why the glucagon is elevated, and the low insulin levels, they are an indication that glucagon is the one that's elevated and hence leading to those symptoms. Am I clear?